Thank you. The UN is taking up the global food crisis today. Secretary Ban Ki-moon announcing a new task force to tackle the problem.
The first and immediate priority issue that we all agreed was that we must feed the hungry.
Meanwhile, members of the House and Senate will meet today to hammer out differences in a new farm bill. That bill includes subsidies to American farmers to not grow crops. So why do something like that in the middle of what the UN calls a food crisis? Joining us now, Sally James, a trade policy analyst with the Cato Institute, and Jake Caldwell. He's the Director of Policy for Agricultural Trade and Energy at the Center for American Progress. Jake, food subsidies, a good idea?
Well, John, I think just stepping back, as we look at a farm bill, Congress goes through this exercise every 5 years. It's a big bill, $300 billion over 5 years. But it's not just home to our safety net for our farmers. It's home to our renewable energy programs, our food stamp program. More Americans are needing food stamps at this moment right now, with food inflation at its highest in 17 years. And it has some money, $4 billion for conservation. But in particular on the renewable energy, what it's saying about biofuels and ethanol and all the controversy over corn-based ethanol is it's saying, hey, let's get off corn-based ethanol. Let's move beyond corn-based ethanol to the next generation of advanced biofuels, sometimes called cellulosic biofuels, that are grown, that are not in competition with food or feed, and that will lower our greenhouse gas emissions. So the answer is, sometimes government incentives in the right place at the right time are a good thing. What we don't need are some of the big commodity subsidies to millionaire farmers that encourage overproduction.
That's, I guess, the rub here, Sally. That $300 billion bill that he's talking about also includes $5 billion for farmers not to grow crops. How do you justify that at a time when the UN says there's a food shortage in the world?
First of all, I think you're talking about the $5 billion which pays farmers whether or not they grow crops. It doesn't actually pay them not to grow crops. But there is a program called the Conservation Reserve Program that pays farmers to take land out of production and supposedly give environmental benefits, if you like, back to the land. I don't think we should be paying them not to do that. Presumably they have an interest in making sure their land stays in good working order. But I also don't think we should be paying them to grow crops either.
All right, well, ethanol is one of the issues that a lot of people say has really kind of goofed up the farm economy. I mean, it's obviously good for farmers if they're able to pay, if they're making all kinds of money. Price of corn has doubled and so forth. But what about that land that's being used to grow corn at a time when people supposedly are growing hungry? Corn for ethanol. Sally?
Well, first of all, it's not that farmers are gaining from this. Corn farmers are growing, but of course hog farmers and ranchers, they're suffering, as are consumers and consumers around the world. I don't think it's a good idea. I don't think it will go anywhere near towards this so-called energy independence that we're trying to aim for. All of the corn in America would only displace about 6% of consumption. So I think it's a misguided policy to begin with, let alone these effects that it's having on poor people around the world.
Jake, I've read that the amount of ethanol, the amount of corn it takes to make ethanol to fill the tank of an SUV could feed a person for a year. Is that right? And if so, does it make sense to be growing corn for ethanol?
Well, John, I'm not so sure about those numbers, but the numbers, it's a question of scale. Right now, the U.S. produces 24% of the world's corn. 24% of our corn crop goes to ethanol production. We produce 40% of the world crop in corn, but only 4% goes to ethanol production. So it's all a matter of scale at this point. A much bigger driver in terms of the food price crisis that we're experiencing right now, and the UN Secretary General is appropriately addressing with this important task force announced today, is the demand and the income growth in China and Asia. It's the high oil costs. If you think it's expensive to fill up at the pump, imagine what it costs to fill up the machinery and the fertilizer to grow crops in this country. And so these are the kinds of things where this farm bill actually does make some positive steps in terms of saying, hey, let's stop using corn, let's move beyond corn, and let's go to the next generation of advanced biofuels. And they better prove that they can do the job.
The argument goes on. We'll continue to watch that farm bill. Jake Caldwell and Sally James, thank you both.
And we continue.